This body of work is actually a kind of love letter to the women who I have admired over the course of my life, of course starting with my mother. But it's also a way of sort of reaffirming for myself the whole notion of female empowerment and where it comes from, which is why I entitled this exhibition, I know upon whose shoulders I stand, I am not confused. I think many times we don't acknowledge the way that we got the way we are, how we got to be strong, how we got to be confident, how we got to be women who could do whatever we want to do. I think it's important that we sometimes stop and take stock of the fact that we're standing on someone's shoulders. And so that's what this body of work was about. I thought that I was going to need something really positive to concentrate on as we moved towards 2025. We all knew there was going to be an election. We didn't know how it was going to turn out. At the time that I made the decision to do this show, I didn't even know that we were going to have a woman running for president at that time. So it wasn't based on that information. It was really just based on my need to sort of fortify myself as we see America losing more and more rights for women. It was seemingly, important to make a statement about female empowerment. The group of women that are in this particular exhibition are women that I've honored over and over again. It's not a group of women who just sort of popped up, I think I can go back as far as probably the late 80s as to when I started consciously, intentionally honoring certain women who throughout my life I've either been exposed to through their works or through their words, or as in the case of my mother, of course, all my life she was in it. And so I can say with much confidence that these are women who I am constantly referring back to. Like for instance, I have all of the biographies of Ida B. Wells. I've read everything I can get my hands on about her as a historical figure. Same with Harriet Tubman. The two contemporary political figures were actually in my life. Fannie Lou Hamer I met when I was 13 years old, and of course my parents were raising money for her political party in Mississippi, so I had contact with her, both her thoughts and her words for that long. And Ella Baker was one of the people my parents were connected to through her work with SCLC and then SNCC. So, none of these women are sort of fantasy women for me, so to speak. Elizabeth Catlett was my artistic mentor. My parents put her in front of me when I was 8 years old and decided I wanted to be a sculptor, and they wanted me to have an example of someone who was a black woman who was a sculptor. So they introduced me to her work then. And then, of course, in graduate school, I met her and we became fast friends, and from then on, she was my mentor. So, I feel like these women have been a part of my life, my entire life. There are 7 women total in this exhibition in terms of physical women. Of course, there's 7 Orishas who are female, so those are the other women who are in the space. But the women, I started with my mom, because of course she was the first to empower me. And then I went to Elizabeth Catlett, who was the second in terms of my artistic career. And then there's Elizabeth Catlett, the sculptor. And then there's there's Ida B. Wells, who was how do I describe her? Firebrand. I mean, she was one of the first women. We think about Rosa Parks not giving up her seat on the bus. Well, Ida B. Wells did that in the late 1800s on a train, and was, she won her case, by the way. She took her case to court and won. Of course, they ended up appealing and, of course, reversing everything, but she did win that case against the railroad company who kept her from sitting in the white section. Then there's Harriet Tubman, who was probably one of the first freedom fighters we think of when we think of women freedom fighters, who herself personally went back and freed at least 300 that we know of slaves. And then there's Ella Baker, who is a freedom fighter from the 20th century, was an official with SCLC, but women did not get a lot of the credit in that organization. It was heavily, men who were ministers. But she was really one of the brains behind the organization. And then she decided that when they started complaining about some of the younger members wanting to have power, she said, you know what, I'm gonna support them. And that's when she became what they call the godmother of SNCC, and became the person who was really an advisor and what have you to people like Stokely Carmichael and H. Rap Brown and many of the other SNCC workers, Doris Richardson and what have you. So she's a real important figure in my head, mainly because she was one of those women who did not believe in the spotlight. I mean, she was not trying to garner, a lot of attention publicly for what she was doing. She firmly believed that the organization was what was important, and that organizing was important, and that was the work that she was called to do, was to organize these young people so that they could be successful in their struggles for civil rights. And then, of course, Fannie Lou Hamer is just like an icon for me. I mean, she was a poor woman who didn't really know poverty, meaning she didn't feel that she had a poverty of spirit, she didn't have a poverty of knowledge, she didn't have a poverty of any of those things that are important to make you a leader. And she became a leader in Mississippi at a time when it was very unpopular for Black people to, fight for their right to vote. She risked her family, she risked her life. In fact, her life really was taken as a result of her work in the civil rights movement, because when she sustained a beating in jail, that ultimately led to her dying early in her 60s. And then, of course, Toni Morrison. Everybody knows Toni Morrison because of her fame as a writer, but for me, she was so clear-eyed as far as who she was as a Black feminist. And she kind of defined for many of us what Black feminism looked like. A lot of people don't know that she was responsible for a lot of Black writers managing to get published at a time when that was not very popular, when she was a publisher at Random House. And this was before she was doing her own writing and making herself, known for her own writing. She was making sure that other people got heard, and that was like something that was unheard of back when she was doing it. So for me, Toni Morrison is both important as a writer. I've read every single thing her pen has ever, put on a paper. But I also am really excited about the fact that she remains one of the key figures in Black feminism. So then let me talk a little bit about the Orishas that are in the show, because the Orishas are, for many people, an unknown entity. They don't know anything about African spirituality. And so I have been looking at African spirituality for decades, and one of the aspects of that spirituality is the Orishas that are commonplace in most of the West African nations. Those were artificially constructed, so many of the things that we see happening spiritually had to do with the fact that they were connected at one point. And so what I did was I wanted to look at the Orishas that I felt were directly related to the notion of female empowerment. And so I have, my own Orisha, whose head I am, Oshun, who is an Orisha who is known for passion, for being very powerful, for being both, well, I guess you'd say good and bad, meaning that she can be very passionate in a loving way, but she can be very passionate in a very destructive way if you're doing something that she feels needs to be corrected. So in this case, this piece for Oshun, Oshun is associated with the peacock because of her beauty, but there's also this myth that I used in another installation that I did back in 2017, I believe it was, that she so loved the people that she is serving that when the male Orishas were dishonoring the main supreme god and doing things on earth that they weren't supposed to be doing, she decided that and God decided to punish the people by sending a drought. She decided that she would sacrifice and try to get to God and ask for forgiveness and for some sort of relief. So she travels through space, so to speak. It's very Afrofuturistic, but she travels through space, and because she has to go through the sun, she burns off all of her beautiful peacock feathers and becomes the vulture. And so both the vulture and the peacock are images associated with Oshun, but it shows how selfless she was in order to save society. So I chose for this particular piece to just show the beauty side of Oshun, because what was important to me about this exhibition is that I wanted it to be both beautiful and powerful, because that's basically who we are. You know, we have all of this beauty associated with femininity and all of that, but we better be powerful and know how to use all of that, or it's pointless. So that's why I decided that I was going to have the beautiful image for Oshun, the peacock, be the centerpiece of this. And then, of course, her colors are yellow, white, and gold. And so that's what's surrounding her. And I wanted because I'm calling these medallions and because I wanted these to be really beautiful, that's why I chose to use all of the iridescent kind of paint, so that all of the paint is shimmering. You know, when you look at it, it's all very luminescent, so to speak. You know, then there's Nana Baluku, who is credited with sort of starting the whole universe, the sun and the moon. So that's why the sun and the moon are both in her image. The Adinkra symbol that I'm using there for Nana Baluku is one that it symbolizes the eternity. And then the white rooster, which is only on a couple of them that I put the white rooster, is the symbol of the ancestors. And so, you know, that one is an example of how the ancestors are tied to these orishas, who are tied to the whole universal cycle. The circles are, of course, a sign of continuity. They appear in most traditional African art. You will find circles being an important element, and triangles, which are very strong symbols. And so that's what's happening in that piece. And then there's Yemanya, who is the Orisha who is considered the protector of women, but also the Orisha associated with all things female, you know, your cycle, the moon, water. And so for this one, what I looked at was I wanted to show, of course, this being like a water sort of scene with fish and the moon inside, but then also the notion of the power of water, you know, because we all know we can't live without water. It's a basic, you know, we have to have it. And to have this particular Orisha associated with something so basic to human survival, I think was important to show both that part of her as well as the idea that she's the protector of women. But in essence, she's the protector of the universe as a result of her connection to water and things that was associated with the water. And then, of course, the gold is just my way of sort of, once again, associating something precious and important with her. And then there's Eyelala, who is the Orisha associated with justice, and she will rain, you know, terror upon you if you are being unjust, especially where women are concerned. And then, let's see, who else do I have? Oh, and there's Oya, who is another very powerful Orisha, and Oba. Both of those are Orishas who are associated with the notion of women having strong power, being associated with Shango, who was the most powerful Orisha who was male. And so these Orishas are our spiritual underpinning. And so for me, that was why I picked them to be the ones to honor in this body of work. You know, it's interesting, I spent so many years doing installation that I think no matter what I do, the practice is stemmed in installation. So when this body of work came to my mind, it didn't really come to me as an installation, so to speak, but it became an installation, I guess because I can't help but do installation. I think of space always first. I think of how do I want a body of work to affect the viewers, and that was always the approach that I took when I did my installations. So I almost immediately knew that this had to be sort of like a altar room, and that's one of the reasons why I asked for the small space. I wanted it to be intimate. I wanted it to be personal for people. I wanted it to be something that felt like you were in a spiritual space. And so that also drove how I approached what colors I wanted to use. My protection color of blue had to be present because I was talking about protecting females, protecting this notion of us having power, protecting the conversation around female empowerment. So the blue is constant throughout all of these pieces. And of course, for the Orishas, I was not trying to make a portrait of these Orishas. What I was trying to do was to look at the colors that I know are associated with them, the shapes and elements that I know are associated with them, and incorporate those into an image that would become like my personal portrait of each Orisha. So that's what these images of these Orishas are. And as far as the women are concerned, I've always employed text in my work, be it an installation or a discrete work. So even though I used the text to encircle each woman like a mantra, I wanted people to be able to know what the selection was, which you can't necessarily see this encircling gold letters that clearly. So that's why I created the little medallion that's beneath each woman with their words. I'm calling these things medallions because I want them to be seen as such. The gold, for instance, is always associated with metals, so I feel like that's another connection. But then also the gold is encircling them because they are our gold. These spiritual entities are the gold that keeps us centered and grounded. And so that's why I chose that color to encircle them. And of course the blue around the women is just protecting those particular women who I am still feeling very close to. All of them, of course, are all ancestors now. And someone asked me, they said, well, why didn't you do like Angela Davis or something? I said, I love all of those people, but they're not ancestors. So, the influence that these people have on me is more coming from a very spiritual, very ephemeral kind of realm that I can't put my finger on, but I know that they're still informing every decision I make when I start looking at myself as a woman. When I started thinking about how I wanted to talk about this notion of female empowerment, I thought very carefully about, did you want this to be something that sort of punched people in the gut, because of where we are right now, in this historic moment where Black women, white women, Asian women, Indian women, Latino women all are losing their power by way of these draconian kinds of backsliding in policies that we're seeing? Or did you want to have people think about this in a more deeply personal way? And I opted for the deeply personal way because I feel like that is what's missing in the dialogue today when we talk about the things that are happening to women. We're missing the conversation around what's it doing to our spirit? What's it doing to our ability to connect with each other? So I chose these words very carefully because there are lots of quotes out there from many of these women. And I chose these particular quotes because I think they speak specifically to being a woman and the kinds of things that we have to consider in being a woman in today's society. And of course, with my mother's quote, I picked that one because it was statement she made to me personally about who she saw me as a young, I was 12 years old when she wrote that to me. It was my 6th grade autograph book, which everybody did back those in the 50s. You had your, well, I guess that would have been early 60s. You had your little book and everybody signed there, and they folded over the pages and all that. And my mom had written in my book this quote, "Dear Vicki," and by the way, people will notice that it's a Y on my name, not an I. I had all spellings of the name before I settled on I. Anyway, "Dear Vicki, for such a wonderful daughter as you, how can I express all the wonderful things I hope the future has in store for you? With all your potentiality, I know you will grow to be the kind of adult we will all be proud of." And I'm hoping that I did just that. But that was the kind of mom I had. I mean, she was constantly making me feel like it didn't matter what I decided to do, I could do it. I mean, for me to be able to say at 8 that I wanted to be an artist, and then for my parents to then support that. I mean, we're talking about Black parents who mostly did not do that back in the 1950s. They just basically said, you might want to get another profession. You can do that, but But my parents were big supporters of the arts, so that's what happened, So in this case, I used the Adinkra symbol for her that I also use for Ida B. Wells, that means I am not afraid. Because my mom was fearless. She was on her own by the time she was, I guess she was about 15 or 16, because her dad had died when she was a kid, and then her mom moved out to California when she was in high school, and she refused to leave Philly because she said, I don't know anything about California, I'm not going there, I'm staying in Philly. So she made her way by becoming a babysitter and, living in somebody's house so that she'd have a place to live, and went on to college, got her college financed by Temple University. I mean, she was a really independent woman, and I didn't even know that until I was much, much older, and she and I were having a heart-to-heart. So this is like an example of how, as a child growing up, I had everything I needed to figure out that I could be whoever I wanted to be because of this woman. So, when we look at this, of course, the blue protection around here, and then the gold letters that are circling her, or this quote, but it's created so that it's like a mantra. Because, you have to kind of, in your head, you have to have that ongoing record that tells you, yeah, you are, you can, you will, all of that has to keep going. So that's why we created these like a mantra around each woman. And then their Oshun eyes, the yellow fluorescent eyes. Oshun's colors are yellow, white, and gold. And Oshun is the fierce woman. She's the warrior woman. She's the one that nobody ever could buck. So each one of these women have Oshun eyes because each one of them were powerful warrior women in their own rights, in their own spheres. My mom was a lawyer. Her specialty was education law because she started out her career as a teacher. And she figured out early on that the problem with kids who were in school, Black kids who were in school, brown kids who were in school, who weren't doing well, had to do with what was available for them, and that most of what was available for them depended on the laws. And so the laws needed to be changed. And so that's what motivated her to go to law school and work in the area of education. And that's, when you got that kind of inspiration, you almost can't not succeed. So that's how I look at what my mom did for me as a woman, as a Black woman, as a woman who had agency to do whatever I want to do. This is my example. All of this was meant to really have a personal conversation with the viewers, and mostly women, but the men are looking at it and responding as well, which is great. I love that. But this was a body of work directed at women. And one of the reasons I asked for a symbols key is because I want everyone to know what all of this symbolism means, because my work is always symbolic, from the materials I choose to the text that I include in it, to the colors. All of it's always symbolic. And this time I didn't want people to have to guess, what is she saying? What's that white rooster mean? What is that? particular Adinkra symbol mean, you know. I wanted it to be very clear, because it's a very clear message that I'm sending, that we as women have to begin to understand how important it is for us to support each other, to recognize what needs to be done in our particular communities to make sure that women don't get minimized, and to figure out how to make that all work in a society that seems hell-bent now on driving us back to the 1800s. For me, female empowerment really embodies the ability of women to see each other as allies and to understand how to build on that allyship. It's also about understanding that we have a voice that needs to be heard, and it needs to be clear. Most importantly, it needs to be clear that we can't be that, well, I'm not sure if I should. No, we have to be emphatic about what it is that we need, what it is that we want, and what it is that we're going to do in order to make sure those needs and wants are met. And I don't think there's any room for silence. I don't think there's any room for equivocation. I think that we all need to grasp that this is a battle for us to remain independent and secure in a country that currently, and a world really, that currently has put us back on the auction block, so to speak. You know, we can't go backwards. We have been going backwards, but we can't go backwards. And for me, female empowerment means that we understand that and figure out how do we keep ourselves from backsliding. And that comes from being united. You know, there's always been this big debate since the 60s, basically, when we first started hearing about feminism. Black women knew that we've been dealing with feminism for our entire existence because it's the only way we could make it in this world. We didn't have the luxury of staying at home and taking care of kids and our husband. You know, we had to be out there working, and we had to be very clear about how to make work for us. So for me, Black feminism has always revolved around the notion that we as women, as Black women in particular, have to be supportive of each other. We have to be politically aware so that we are investing in the kinds of things that will make our lives more secure. It also means that we have to understand that we don't have certain luxuries. We have to be realistic about who we are in this society. And we have to be very realistic about how we approach all of the things that we need as women, as Black women in this society. And that means from the political organizing that has to happen to the social organizing that has to happen. My mother used to say when I asked her if I could join a sorority and she forbade me from doing so, it wasn't that she necessarily cared a lot about sororities being this or that or the other, but what she said is that Black people cannot afford to subdivide. We have to all be on the same page because that's the only way we're going to get where we need to go. And so even though now we've seen, you know, how Black sororities and you know, social groups can be very effective in helping to organize, I think we also see that maybe all of that past separation didn't really help us. And so I kind of buy into my mom's philosophy that, you know, the subdivisions that we see in the Black community cannot exist if we are going to move forward as a group. And as far as Black feminists are concerned, you know, we've had factions within that group in terms of what it is, what it isn't. You know, we have to get on the same page because it's all about our ability to survive the onslaughts that are coming from, you know, fights against DEIA or DEI, I guess it is DIA, isn't it? DEI, to the ways in which we watched Kamala Harris get disrespected as a Black woman as she ran for office. You know, all of those things are, to me, an indication that Black feminism is an important element, especially in my life. I am constantly aware of those elements of it that I have to embrace and I have to reinforce and I have to, in some ways, pass on to whomever I can pass them on to.